Good morning. I'm so glad you can join me here at Red Pine Quilt Shop in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. I'm Connie, and today I'm going to be talking with you about piping hot binding using Susan Cleveland's directions and her tool. So this is her book, and she has two tools, the one that comes with the book, and then the Grand, which is a little bigger. Let me show you what you can do with this. Here are two quilts that I did a few years ago, and I did put the piping hot binding on it. There's a lot going on this quilt, and I thought that the piping really made it kind of stand out and definitely made the edge noticeable. This is an almost solid fabric. Let me show you another one that I did. Now, some of you already know I love selvages. And so I put a double piping on here. Again, there's lots going on, but I just wanted to finish up the quilt. Now, if I'm really honest about it, one of these pipings is the same cape as the back, and probably a stronger contrast might have had a better impact, but I'm happy with it anyway. Double piping. This is not hard to do. Let me show you. This is the piping. I have the cording, which in Susan Cleveland's book, she's going to show you how to shrink it, so you don't worry about that later. But I did shrink the cording, I knotted the edges. This piping was cut on the bias. And again, everything that she asks you to do, she has clear, detailed instructions, including illustrations. Now here's a biggie. For you lefties, she also gives illustrations if you're left-handed and you're right-handed. I think that's great. So I've got this cording. I have the bias strip folded and I sewed it in. You notice that I sewed it using a matching thread, both on the top side and the back side. Now, there's plenty of tips and kind of a walkthrough to help you think about what foot you might like to use, because all machines aren't the same. She doesn't assume everyone has a specific tool. And she also talks some about using your needle position and shifting it to the left or the right. Now, I've done quite a few of these. I like to use my I foot or the zipper foot. I also use my dual feed. But whatever foot works for you is going to be the one that you should use. And she's going to kind of walk you through that so you can make your best choice. But let me show you how this is so easy, and I'll just say fun, to trim. You notice the tool. It has grooves on both sides. This groove has the 1/4 inch for the seam allowance, and this one is wider. You're going to place it on your cutting mat, put the piping in the groove. Look how that slides. Easy to cut. You could very simply cut the piping for a 100-inch square quilt in just a few minutes. It really would not take very long, and it would be very, very accurate. So there I have the piping. This is going to be my seam allowance, and I'll be using that as a guide so it stays square. So let's say this was my quilt. I sewed the piping on, and when I'm sewing the piping on, I really like using these Wonder Clips. They're small, they really are tight, they hold things where they're supposed to be. So I sewed this on, and again, I decided to use the zipper foot, but make your own choice. Here's the real trick. On the bobbin, I used a contrasting thread. So I know on this back side exactly where I had the seam line on the front for the piping. And you may notice if I put my fingernail here, I have a couple of threads where I could still sew against the piping without sewing into the piping. Now this next part is where it feels confusing, but once you've done it, you're going to be okay. And again, her instructions and illustrations for righties and lefties is really easy to follow, along with YouTube videos where she talks about it. My binding. This is my top, my piping. Now this is going to feel so backwards, but trust me, you want to do it this way. You notice that I'm putting it counterintuitive. I am attaching this binding on the top side going up. Here's why. I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to be sewing it from the back side. This is where that contrasting stitch line is so important. You're going to be sewing just inside of that stitch line. And that way, your piping is going to be right in that seam. You're not going to see any of the threads or the sewing for the piping. When you come to a corner, you will just do you're going to be doing this just like you always would. And continue pinning it, turn it, and sew. Let me just let that sink in for a minute. You're going to attach the binding on the top side over the piping going up so that when you turn it to the back side, you're going to be sewing the way you expect to sew binding on. Then your binding is going to look great. So one of the things I really like to look for when I'm buying a tool or a direction booklet is variations. I don't want to just use it for one thing. Well, Susan Cleveland has some great variations. As you saw on my quilt where I did the double binding, it really isn't that much harder than putting on double piping. It's not harder than putting on a single piping. But here's some other ideas that she has for you. The first one is to use the wide side of the trimming tool. And this is going to give you a much wider binding. So I had this wider binding. You do notice it's quite a bit wider than what I had on this other side. I sewed it on. And when I turn this, I'm going to have a nice plumped, wider, but still very even binding. I think that would make a great edge if you had a busier quilt or a bigger one. Another thing I point out, one of the variations, is to make a scrappy piping. Now again, all of the pipings are cut on the bias, and she shows you exactly how to do that with illustrations for right-handed people and left-handed people. So it's the wide binding, or you could do a scrappy piping. Another way that you can use the piping tool is to put the piping within your quilt top before you have it quilted. So I had seen something like this at a quilt show years ago, and it has always kind of intrigued me. This is just some strips. I put in some piping. I think it's kind of interesting in what would have just been stripes. Same thing happened here. When I sewed it in, I have that dark stitch line that I want to be sure that I'm on the inside of the piece. And then when I pressed it. The only thing I'd say about this is if you're going to take a quilt that has piping within the top to your long armor, talk about it with them before. I think a freestyle, free motion is not going to have a problem. If it's digital edge to edge, there's a good chance you're going to be sewing over the piping, which probably isn't going to give you the impact that you would hope for. So there, put the piping within your quilt in the blocks, maybe put it along a border. Could have a lot of impact. And my last two is to have the piping be the edge of the quilt. Now, in order to do this, your corners have to be round. This is not going to work with 90-degree corners. So this would, kind of like, you know, pillows and upholstery. That would be your edge. Your binding would go completely to the back. Now this binding, in order for it to go around the curve, it also needs to be cut on the bias. Now I didn't trim this up because I wanted you to see something. I left the square of the quilt, and with a marker I used, I suppose, a jar lid, and I made the circle. And then I sewed along it, put the piping on. Now you notice that I have, with the exception right there, I have my stitching line, so I have somewhere to guide me as I'm putting the binding on it. Now, one of the things that Susan Cleveland has in this book is a really great way to square up the quilt. Now, I'm not going to go into that now, but it's really worth checking out and seeing how she suggests that you square the quilt and sew the binding on and trim it so you have a really great square quilt when you're done. My last idea for you is something that's not piping. So what if you put rickrack or some sort of a braid on? This one, I did make a line so I knew where to sew. And once again, I've got that stitch line on the back side. I didn't put the binding on because I wanted to show you a couple of options. What if I did that binding and this braid became the edge? Wouldn't that be fun? Like for placemats, table runner, you know, maybe a little kid quilt. I think that could be really fun. Or maybe you want to go a little bit more traditional, and you could put the binding on like this. I think this also could be really fun within a border of a quilt to kind of show, I don't know, put the pattern in a little bit more. So I had a lot of variations. It's very, very simple to trim this using the trim tool. And her directions on sewing the binding over the piping really makes it easy for you to get an excellent result. It'll take a little longer, but it's not hard. Plus you've got some choices on what you might want to do. Putting piping on quilts that are special gifts is kind of the way I do it now because I think it looks so nice. But again, it isn't harder. You just follow her steps and use her illustrations, and you're going to have a great quilt with really great piping and binding. Well, happy quilting. I hope you stay cool.